actually happening. Now, I won't go into the details of the tactics here. I've done that on a bunch of other occasions, and you can go to our website and see that. But the bottom line is the faster and more dramatically policy acts to move down this curve and move up the competition curve, the sooner we'll get to that moment where we're building out gigabit networks. So the bonus question is, how could we blow it? There are some signs of early success: Kansas City, Austin, Chicago, Seattle, Champaign-Urbana, North Carolina. But there are lots of ways we can still blow it. And they all, to me, boil down to this one thing, which is lack of focus on the right thing. So one example is if you read all the most recent articles, and there have been a lot of them, about broadband policy in the New York Times, what you see is a debate which centers on the question of how are we doing today. Some are arguing we're doing horribly, others argue we're doing great, we lead the world. But to me, this is completely irrelevant to the policy question, which is what do we need to do to lead in the future? You know, when Mike and I talked, he talked about how we worked together. Everything that we did that was valuable didn't really play out for 5 or 10 years. And you have to have that mindset if you're serious and you're in the government. You have to have that understanding. So if we're talking about how are we doing today, we're simply reflecting those decisions that were made, actually many of them when Mike and I were still there. So that's really not the relevant question. The question is, as the great Gretzky would say, where do we need to skate to? Because where's the puck going to be? But that's not the debate you see anywhere on the editorial pages or even in the halls of Congress or even at the FCC. Another example of losing focus is the former chairs in January, the former chairman of the FCC identified, issued a challenge to the League of Cities that there should be a gigabit community in every state. Now, I'm grateful that about 3 years after the plan identified a need for a critical mass of gigabit communities, the chair also recognized that need. But the challenge, you know, was that a solution to anything? What's the analysis behind it? What's the strategy? It implies that the only thing keeping us from having gigabit networks is the fact that the chairman had not asked the mayors for it. That's positively silly. If it were only thus, we could have gigabit networks everywhere. But that's not really what is keeping us back. The Gigabit Challenge had no analytic foundation, no strategy, no follow-up. And in the real world, it got a lot of great press, which was its intent, but it accomplished nothing. The Google Fiber effort, the GIG.U effort, and there are others, have enormous challenges, and they've not been made better by FCC policy, by the way. Success is not guaranteed. They involve both financial and human capital risk, but they're grounded in deep analysis, clear strategy, and a commitment to follow up. So policy doesn't involve the same risks, but it should be just as grounded, just as serious, and just as focused on the real challenge ahead. And I know a lot of mayors understand this, and thanks to them, GIG.U looks like it'll accomplish what it set out to do. And I also think the new leadership, both currently at the FCC and incoming at the FCC, understand this. So there are reasons for optimism. But I still see many forces in DC in particular that could distract us from accomplishing what we need to have, that ubiquitous, diverse, and constantly improving broadband ecosystem. So I've answered 4 questions, but let me now end with a question for all of you. Israel just announced a plan to deploy a national gigabit network. Cisco CEO John Chambers, announcing his company's investment in that project, predicted that Israel will be ground zero for the process of country transformation that digital technology can deliver. So my question is, why isn't he making that prediction about the United States? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Blair. Our next speaker is somebody who's trying to make sure that the U.S. does not blow it. His name is Craig Settles, and he has agreed to wake up at 5:30 West Coast time to be with us today. Craig is the host of Gigabit Nation, which is a web-based radio talk show. He's interviewed a lot of the key players in the gigabit networking game, including our other 2 panelists. And he also consults with communities around the country as they try to put together their gigabit strategy. He's written a very useful ebook that was just published in May called Building the Gigabit City. And if you want to follow up on the details of the topic we're talking about today, I urge you to look at that book. So Craig, I'm going to turn it over to you for some remarks on how to get the people part of the equation right.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, even though it is mighty early in California, but we shall persevere and move on. Let me make one point, and then I'll start talking about the community participation part. When the broadband plan initiated, or I guess talks of having a national network and so forth initiated in 2008 and 2009, one of my considerations or comments that I made rather frequently was that one of the better things that Washington could do and some of the that states could do is to allow the communities to develop their strategies for using broadband, and that the government be more of a conduit of resources to address these various approaches and strategies within some sort of criteria. In other words, the communities would have to show that there's a need. They have to show how they're going to meet the need. In essence, because of the differences of each community, that a lot of the discussion needs to be driven from the community level, and then the government should be providing assistance to communities to, in essence, do what they have identified as the best path forward. And we can probably talk about this, collectively after all of our remarks. If we follow that philosophy, then what needs to happen? The question is, what needs to happen at the community level? And so I've identified a number of steps that seem to be the consistent themes for success for those communities that are building effective gigabit networks, and it's built from a combination of my personal experience in consulting, but also having interviewed dozens, if not hundreds, of different communities. The first thing foremost is for those communities to identify the key stakeholders, the key leaders as individuals, but also the larger organizations within the community, and to go out and ask them, what are the needs? What are the things that we could do if we had better, faster broadband? And what I consistently find is that if you go to the right stakeholders, they will start to develop a skeleton, if you will, of what makes sense. They will identify problems, they'll identify solutions of what you can do with the network, because ultimately you've got to sell this network locally based on what it's going to do to help and improve the community. And so by going to these stakeholders initially, you start to get the skeleton. You also identify people who will be your initial major investors in the network, your initial major customers for the network, and you've got to have an anchor base of key customers in order to make the network financially viable. So that's your first step. Second step is going to the constituents to ask them, how would you use broadband? How would this make your world better, more effective? In a research project I did with the city of Benicia, California, to help their industrial park, which is the heart of their economic engine for their community, the three major questions are, what are you doing with broadband currently? Are you satisfied? Could you get more from your broadband? And how do you see broadband being effective for you in 3 to 5 years? And questions that grew from those core set of questions basically allowed those folks in the business park to identify the fact that they have a need. They identified what meeting that need would do for them, and if you ask enough people the right series of questions, you start to develop your initial customer base, your initial people willing to write a check to make that network a reality. From there, I think you need to look at what are your possibilities for business models, and I think we have a lot of folks have a very narrow view. Either the incumbents are going to do it all by themselves, communities are going to be owners of the network and they're going to do it by themselves, and then the reality there are variations. There are variations in which local businesses can be the owners. There are options where both residents and businesses can build the infrastructure or help pay for the infrastructure that comes to their premises. In other words, sharing the cost. You have co-ops, you have nonprofits that can be created or tapped to help fund these network projects. But in looking at the different models, whether it's going to be public-private partnership, whether it's going to be nonprofit community-driven, whether it's going to be key stakeholders investing in creating a network company, as was done in Emporia, Kansas, I believe, where a group of businessmen who have been in the telecom industry started a telecom company from scratch to meet local needs. And as you identify the possibilities for what kind of business model makes sense based on the needs, you can see the way forward, I believe, to having an effective network. Whether you go and petition Google, whether you go and go to your local telecom companies and you say, look, we've identified all of these needs. We're coming in with letters of understanding and letters of commitment and pledge cards and so forth, that you drive the process forward by having identified customers and, in essence, identified a viable business plan, if you will. The next and sort of the next to last step, if you will, is identifying the one project that will move your network forward. In Chattanooga's case, it was building a network to service the smart grid, and that was their initial application. Now, of course, the network is being used in a myriad of ways, but that initial focus, that initial project, is what got the network established, got it off the ground, and in some respects created the first level of cost justification for doing that network. In other communities, it may be to improve economic development locally. Danville being a great example. Danville, Virginia, of their primary goal was to turn their local economy around, which had 18-19% unemployment when they started this project, and now 3-4 years later, they've cut their unemployment in half. They've brought a lot of businesses and new jobs to the community. But that singular focus is what takes all of those ideas that you've generated through the whole needs assessment process and then gives it focus and shape and moves things forward. And then finally, you need some marketing plan. And it was interesting, there was a blog post that I saw this morning where someone was saying, broadband is an economic decision, it's not a holy crusade. And I would differ greatly with that assessment. I believe that at a certain level, this becomes a marketing exercise. And for those of us who have been in marketing, which is really where I was long before community broadband took over my life, you are in essence creating a crusade, a sense of excitement, a sense of energy, a sense of urgency, but it's marketing driven. And there was a guy on my radio show from Como Cooperative in Central Missouri who talks about how they took their pilot project for their network and they started running a campaign very similar to a political campaign. They did polling, they did surveys, they did, in essence, campaign appearances, going neighborhood to neighborhood, having group meetings, and having their neighborhood champions stand up and motivate the crowd to get them to buy and invest emotionally into this process. And so by executing the basic fundamentals of good marketing, have moved their network project forward. They've got higher than average, what we consider, I guess, average take rates. I mean, we're talking about 40, 46, 47% take rate. They have figured out how to lower their cost. They've identified customers for, in essence, the rest of their build-out beyond the pilot project because of the effectiveness of their marketing. So if we look at these 5 steps, I think that this, at the micro level, at the community level, is how you move the dime, move people off the dime and get these projects moving forward. I'll turn over the mic now to my California colleague, who's also here bright and early.
I appreciate that, Craig. You really give us a nice overview of what's going on and how you're mobilizing communities. Our third speaker is Milo Medin. He is one of the pioneers of broadband. I got to know him more than 20 years ago when I was working with Al Gore, and he was still working at NASA. where he helped build out some of the first research networks for the federal government. Milo got bitten by the dot-com bug and became the Chief Technology Officer of At Home. If any of you have a cable modem, you owe a lot to Milo. He helped pioneer cable modems and helped build the first broadband residential network. Now he's working at Google, where he's in charge of their Google Fiber initiative. I owe a lot to Milo myself. He was a mentor, helped me understand how the internet was growing back 20 years ago when I was first here in Washington. So we've heard from the lawyer and the financial analysts. We've heard from the marketer and the community activist. Now we're going to hear from the technologist. And over to you, Milo. And thanks again for waking up so early.
No problem, Mike. It's great to be with all of you. So just a few bullets that I think help shape kind of how we think about gigabit networks at Google. Google Fiber started off as basically an experiment. And it's really the result of the National Broadband Plan, because back in 2009, as my friend Blair was running the National Broadband Plan, they were taking input, and a team here at Google was trying to figure out what to advocate. And a group said, well, you know, the federal government should go build a gigabit network and connect up everybody in a city and see what happens. And when Google's a very odd company, because when this went to our management team, the management team basically said, well, why are we whining to the government about this? If it's important, we should do it ourselves. And so the decision was made to go out and see if any communities would partner with us to go build a gigabit network. And I think the sense was maybe a dozen cities would be interested. This kind of gigabit stuff is really esoteric. 1,100 communities came back and said, we want this. And these communities are not led by engineers. These communities were led by people who saw the economic benefit, the benefit to their educational institutions, and competitive benefits. And that really informed Google. This is something that the communities actually changed Google's mindset about gigabit networks. And the question was raised, could you actually turn this into a business? I was recruited in December of 2010 to see if we couldn't turn it into a business. And so that explains kind of why you heard a lot of talk about it from an experiment, and now all of a sudden you're hearing talk about a commercial enterprise, right? Because we made that transition. That we came up with a different kind of way of deploying networks. And that's what you see rolled out in Kansas City, which you're going to see in Austin, and the conversion of the existing fiber network in Provo, Utah. There are two main things that go back to Blairs Formula that we've tried to do. We've tried to work with communities to lower cost. One of our big benefits is we don't have to be anywhere. You know, $1 in Kentucky is the same as $1 in California, is the same as $1 in Kansas. So we go. People ask me, well, what's the secret to getting Google Fiber in your city? And I always say, just make it easy, right? If you make it hard, enjoy your cable connection, right? But if you make it easy, you know, that helps lower our costs, makes it easier to deploy the service quicker, etc. And so we work with communities who are willing to. We don't ask for tax breaks, we don't ask for money, we ask them to do something 100 times harder, which is to fix a lot of their processes for permitting, for rights of way, for inspection. It's a long laundry list of items, but they all make a difference. And the second thing we do is try and aggregate demand. The traditional way carriers have built networks is they pick an area, somebody from marketing, somebody from legal, and an engineer, pick a service area, spend CapEx, build out that area, and then market people one at a time. Rather than us trying to decide where the right place to build is, we let the community do that. So we break up the area into what we call fiber hoods, and every fiber hood has a target take rate associated with it. And when that take rate is hit, as part of a rally sign-up process, then we go through, when we build that area, we connect up all those users all at once. So you don't have this long one-at-a-time marketing thing on the back end. You preload that at the front end, and that does great things for the business model. Somebody once said, and it's an oversimplification, but if everybody wants a gig, everybody can get a gig. And that has to do with the physics of the take rate. If enough people want it, the economics work. If enough people don't want it, then the economics don't work. And so, part of this is trying to build a product that people really want, people will sign up for. For us, that means we do a very high-end TV service as well as gigabit data. We have a free product that after you pay a construction fee to connect up your home, you get 5 megabits for 7 years. And again, that's to drive as many people on net when it's the cheapest to connect them when we're initially building the area out. People ask, why does anybody need a gigabit? Why is a gigabit useful? Almost 20 years ago, we rolled out the first residential cable modem systems. And I remember at the time people said, who could use 5 megabits? Who could use 10 megabits? That's so much more data than the internet can handle. After all, the whole web is based on 56 kilobit dial-up modems. Nobody needs this kind of capacity. Unfortunately, I am old enough to have that kind of experience and lived through that. Found that a lot of people had uses. Initially, of course, it's very high peak to average traffic that gives you that very satisfying, quick response. We do a lot of things to make the gigabit be more relevant. We bundle a terabyte of Google Drive with our product because we think being close to the cloud really helps a lot in terms of your ability to make the gigabit be useful. Another thing that's really a differentiator is the upstream speed. Today, most of the access networks in the U.S. are heavily biased towards downstream traffic, very asymmetric. Our product is designed to be a symmetric product, and the ability to upload at a gigabit is, particularly being able to upload to the cloud at a gigabit, is really very important and a big differentiator. Lastly, we do a lot of things, not just to extend gigabit in the home with the kind of equipment we built, but also to make services on our network work better. So, for example, we have CDNs from Akamai, from YouTube, and from Netflix co-located in Kansas City. You're literally about a millisecond away from the server that streams those things to you. So today, on most cable networks, even if you subscribe to a 100 megabit tier at Time Warner Cable, if you're on a 100 megabit tier with Time Warner Cable, you still can't get a reliable YouTube stream because of interconnect policies. We co-locate those servers in Kansas City, and so you get a 1080p stream can start with virtually no buffering and no hiccups. And so it's not just the fact that we've got a fast access network. We've designed the entire system to try and deliver a really high-quality end-to-end experience. And that has made the product be something that's very much in demand in Kansas City. In Austin, Texas was interesting. In the first 24 hours, 45,000 people signed up for news, and 35,000 people. There are only 330,000 homes in the city of Austin. 35,000 people signed up to be volunteers to go recruit their neighbors to sign up for a gigabit service. So it should tell you that there is quite a bit of demand for a product like this, and we're really excited about these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milo, and I'm glad to see that the sun has come up on the West Coast.
No, it's the automatic lighting system in my office, actually. It turns off after a while.
Well, I'm the moderator, so I get to ask the first and really obvious question. Milo, you started to answer it, but the question I think we're all here to explore is, what are people really going to do with a gigabit that they couldn't do with 50 megabits or even 20 megabits? When Internet 2 was first rolled out to universities, everybody got 3 or 4 megabits per second. It was much faster than what they were used to. And the first thing all the students did was pirating music and watching videos. Tell me there's more. What is it really going to be like? What applications are people going to be talking about in 5 years that are going to drive deployment here? This is a question for all three of our panelists. So, Blair, do you want to start with that?
There are an infinite number of ways to try to answer that question. You can answer it with like specific applications, genetic sequencing, immersive gaming, certain kinds of collaboration. But actually, I want to answer it from the country's point of view, which is why do we want to be ahead of the curve on this? Which is simply this. It's not so simple, but if you look at the sweep of history in terms of economic history, progress is always made when there's innovation in terms of an exchange of inputs. So that, 5,000 years ago, we exchanged human labor with animal labor. And those societies which were a kind of advanced in terms of using cows and horses and et cetera to do the agricultural work prospered. A couple hundred years ago, or even a little bit more, England started to prosper by exchanging animal energy and human energy with mechanical energy. 100 years ago, the United States got ahead by exchanging certain inputs. Steel, for example, was an input to a lot of products and transportation and stuff like that. The big, there are several big macroeconomic stories. One of them is the shift of economic power from west to east. I won't go into that one, but though it actually is relevant to this. But the really big one is we're exchanging the fundamental inputs of the economy value proposition being the manipulation of atoms to inputs based on bits, chips, and bandwidth, right? So we are substituting bandwidth for all kinds of other things which used to require atoms. If we want to lead in that, we want people to be thinking to have a psychology of bandwidth abundance. We want them to always say bandwidth is cheap, because in fact, incremental bandwidth is cheap. And we want them to substitute it for everything else wherever it's possible. And that will drive all kinds of economic activity, and we want to lead in that. At the time we were doing the plan, a number of the incumbents, entirely appropriately in my view, from their because I used to be on Wall Street, from a stock perspective, we're talking about the psychology of bandwidth scarcity. How do we allocate a scarce resource? Which makes sense because they built their networks not for abundant data, but rather one for voice, one for video. And the bandwidth came later, and so there's a real challenge to how you allocate that scarcity. But what we want to move to is that abundance. And Milo has the benefit in some sense of being able to design a network that's data from the beginning and abundant from the beginning. And it's not an accident that cable systems have 7 or 9 different segments, because fundamentally what they're doing is what most businesses do, which is how do you sell the minimum product at the maximum price for an individual customer. There's nothing illegal or immoral about that. That's just what businesses do. What Milo is trying to do is figure out how do you lower the cost of deployment so that you can sell basically unlimited capacity. So the answer is driven by that psychology of bandwidth abundance. I'm too old to figure out what that great use will be, but it's not an accident that there's always some 23-year-old kid with a massively abundant network, or it's a 19-year-old kid like Mark Zuckerberg or something, who figures out a use that requires that abundance and not somebody of my age.
Before I turn to Craig, I want to remind everybody that our hashtag today is ISOC-DC. If you have questions, if you're out in virtual land and you have a question, you can either post it to Twitter with that hashtag, or you can just put it on the live stream chat feature. So, Craig, what are people excited about? When you go and talk to communities, what specific things are they dreaming of doing?
Well, before even going into specific applications, which in many respects are community-driven to begin with, I believe that we shortchange the discussion by asking the question, who needs a gigabit? Because I think the value of the gigabit is in the aggregate. In other words, it is the fact that 1,000 students in a community may have this great new application for classroom learning, for engaging parents and teachers in collaboration with how those students are learning and so forth. And it is the ability for many people to use what may be just average applications that may only require 3, 4 megs or 10 megs of speed per person, but it is the huge number of those either individuals or businesses or organizations using the network at one time, and this is where fundamentally we need all of that bandwidth. And when we look at the discussion from that point, you know, the question of, well, do we need to get a gigabit becomes an easier discussion to move forward, because it is the aggregate that makes sense. So then as you go to schools, and schools say, well, we have a new teaching philosophy called flipped classrooms, where our students get all of their lecture material via YouTube at home, and they come into class and do discussion and so forth. Well, in order for that to work, some X numbers, hundreds, thousands of homes have to be able to all log on to the internet in the course of that evening to get all that information. So you need a gigabit to support those kinds of numbers. If I have a business park, or if I have 5 or 6 business parks, and those companies want to use cloud computing, the gigabit is more essential because of all of those companies together and what they need in aggregate. So I think that we need to start every discussion from the perspective of, you know, what are we trying to do as a whole? And that drives a lot of the issue of you know, why do we need this much bandwidth? Now, as time will go on, each of those segments of the community, where we're talking medical, education, businesses, and so forth, they will come up with ways of using video. They will come up with ways of moving huge graphic documents, huge data files that will then start to use more and more of the bandwidth. And then, yes, down at the individual level, we'll start to talk about, you know, here's how the individual can use this application. I think that video will be the biggest driver. So it's not so much any one thing as much as it is the use of video to change how businesses communicate, to change how doctors talk with patients and communicate with other hospitals. That use of video will be a big driver and a driver of a need for bandwidth or increased bandwidth. I think that the cloud will be the business motivation that will drive greater and greater uses of bandwidth. I think that just data in general, you know, huge amounts of data will drive education applications and in that particular arena.
Okay.
So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Clearly, Craig's identified one place where we need a gig, and that's the classroom. And I would just note, tomorrow there's a hearing in the Senate about Senator Rockefeller's call to upgrade the E-rate so that it funds a gig into the classroom. Friday, the FCC kicks off a proceeding to do precisely that. That certainly will be one of the more interesting proceedings to watch over the next 6 months.
Okay. Milo, do you have any comments on what people
Sure.
are doing with the upstream version of the upstream piece of the capacity that you're building?
First off, just a couple things. We don't offer a tiered set of speeds. It's either the free service at 5 megabit down or a gigabit. Part of that is because we want to make sure everybody is equipped with the gigabit. It goes back to something that Craig said, the value in the aggregate of everybody being connected at a gig allows you to do a bunch more things than just having maybe 2 or 3% of your sub base up at a gigabit. It also is a huge differentiator from a product perspective. You know, if you're an incumbent, you have all kinds of people who are already your customers. If you're a new entrant, you've got to offer a differentiated product to be able to actually get people to sign up. So you have all these people who are connected at a gig. We also connect up schools and libraries at a gig, and in cities that we connect, anchor institutions. So all of those things help us drive gigabit adoption in a community. With regards to use, a lot of it is what we see today is kind of like what happened, 15 years ago. One of our first test users at Stanford is our science professor. After getting connected, he goes to iTunes, buys a movie. iTunes says it's going to download in about 2.5 hours. It's done in less than 4 minutes. And he goes, wow. Now, anytime he wants to buy a movie, he can do that without having to think about, well, I'll buy it now, and then later on in the evening I'll go be able to watch it, etc. We bundle a terabyte of Google Drive with each of our premium products. And so what that means is you can move your data into the cloud very quickly. And so from the pictures being uploaded, the ability to do high-resolution video conferencing, all of those kind of things take advantage of the upstream speeds. You might think, well, what's the big deal, because cable has 5 megabit uploads today, and that should be adequate for video conferencing. Turns out the 5 isn't always available. And so you don't necessarily need a gigabit, but it's a big differentiator. And lastly, it's important to think about the home as not just one user in front of a PC. You have large numbers of devices now, game consoles, televisions. Everybody's contending for wide area access capacity. And part of what we've seen from our subscribers is they're telling us they no longer have to fight over who gets the bandwidth. You start up a Netflix stream on a conventional network, and your PlayStation starts slowing down from a gaming perspective, and results in your kids yelling at each other. Hey, turn that off! I'm getting too much lag, etc. And so now you've got enough access capacity, both in the upstream and the downstream, that you don't have to contend from all these devices. So all the tablets, all the Blu-ray players, all the TVs, all the game consoles, all your laptops, etc., all those kind of devices now can each get a large amount of capacity. So that was not present in the first first half of the broadband revolution, because you didn't have local networks at home. Now we have pretty fast local networks at home. You have a large number of aggregated devices, and so the ability to use that capacity in the aggregate turns out to be very important.
Thank you, Milo. Okay, now we've got half an hour for the audience participation segment. Please step up to the microphone so our virtual audience can hear you, and please introduce yourself. I noticed that we have a number of internet policy gurus in the audience, including Kevin Werbach, who worked with me and Blair at the FCC, and Roger Cocchetti, who's been working on international internet issues for ages. So I know we got lots of good questions coming. Can you turn the switch on?
I'm Gabe Goldberg. I go back far enough to remember when 2400 was blazing fast. I remember 300 and 1200. My question is, while gigabit is the leading edge, there's still a trailing edge of people who either have no broadband or have very limited, very lousy broadband. I have friends who have satellite internet, and they suffer when a cloud goes over. So my question is there hope, is there a plan for gigabit to address what are now the black holes, the underserved communities, rather than simply potentially widening the digital divide into a digital abyss, where some people are getting the gigabit and other people are still suffering either with dial-up or very sketchy and really not broadband at all service?
Let me turn over to Blair first, since that was a key component of the National Broadband Plan.
Yeah, actually more than 50% of our budget and 50% of my own personal time was spent on that issue. I would say that that issue is diminishing over time for a variety of reasons, including much faster LTE going into areas where there isn't currently good broadband. There's a spin-off of GIG.U called Air.U, which is seeking to utilize white spaces technology for precisely that reason. Because what you have in rural areas is you have a density problem which makes the economics of wired difficult, but you have, unlike in urban areas where you have a spectrum crunch, there you have excessive spectrum. So there are a variety of different things. I won't bore you with a dissertation on the FCC's current universal service plans. I don't think, frankly, we're on a path to get there through universal service funding. That may be corrected, it may not. But the major point I would say is, I think that as an economy we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. these are fundamentally different problems we're trying to address. And I think we need to constantly have the ability to address different problems at the same time. But they are connected in the following way, that as a society, we need to get everybody on, and we need to transition how we do a lot of things, particularly education, healthcare, and government services, from what is fundamentally an analog platform to a digital platform. And that part of the problem government faces today, and I've felt this, I remember about 7 years ago, my sister, who's a school teacher, said, I don't know what to do because I want to give my kids the ability to use the internet to do their homework, but I got, like half my kids don't have the internet at home. So I don't want to hold half the school back, but I don't want to disadvantage. So we got to move everybody to a minimum, and I think that's an important point.
Milo, do you want to address this question as well? Is Google just serving the elite and the gamers, or you have a plan for everyone?
Well, again, Google really cares about doing good and doing good business at the same time, which is a challenge from Larry Page, our CEO. Part of what we do with the free product is being able to provide a baseline speed. You don't need fiber to do that, but basically turning kind of basic speed into almost a utility. Once it's connected to a home, we give at least 7 years of free service at 5 down. We've been working with apartment buildings. Many poor people live in apartment units, and we've been able to get a lot of agreements done where apartment owners think now of wiring up their units for fiber and now can sell a basic internet service as part of their rent. And so that yields this competitive dimension between apartment buildings that have the service and apartment buildings that don't. And that can provide a basic level of connectivity to address that in markets where we're building. The rural America has a different problem. As Blair said, there's a fundamental density issue. I would point out that it may not be obvious, but large cities also have a cost problem. It's driven not by a density problem, it's driven by a bureaucracy problem. But the physics of upgrades work the same way on both ends, whether you've got cost due to low density or cost due to bureaucratic processes. And so we have Waxahachie, Texas may have some of the same issues that some of large cities do with regards to next generation upgrades.
Do you have a percentage of your possible users who are just saying, I don't want anything? Even the free service?
Yeah, we did an extensive digital sort of divide analysis in the Kansas City market on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. It's really interesting. There are some people where it's an economic issue. They can't afford it. There are another set of people who just don't think it's useful. And we found a high correlation. If you believe that having an internet connection is essential for being able to apply for a job, then you have a strong correlation to saying, I need to be connected. If you don't believe that's true, right, that you don't need internet to go find a job, then a lot of those people don't want to be connected. They don't see the value in it. And it's interesting when you tell them, you can't apply for a job at Walmart anymore unless you're online. Once you tell them that, they start, really? In other areas, it's an age and stage issue. Some people, older people, are a little bit less comfortable with technology. So how you address these gaps really depends on what neighborhood you're in, what are the demographics of that area. And so we've been working with a number of community groups to try and apply the right therapy, so to speak, to address these issues on a local basis.
As Craig said earlier, you have to have different solutions for different people. So I'll turn to Patrick here with a question.
Hi, my name is Patrick Roanhouse. I'm a freelance technology journalist and internet culture journalist. My background, I used to be in IT and for government contracting stuff, and I quit because of ethical reasons. One of the main, I actually have just a couple questions, mostly for Milo, is does having everyone on gig allow for easier allocation of networks? Does Google in particular deliver full gigabit during non-peak times, or during peak times do they treat it differently, like how when you say you're going to get 25 megabits per second from Verizon, they don't actually promise you that connection during certain times? where is Google's support for open access networks, particularly because they originally promised that with Kansas City, but with the other networks they're developing, they have said that they're not necessarily going to do open access. Where is the view?
Let's give Milo
Sorry about
a
that.
finite number of questions. So Milo, you want to take?
It was a little bit hard to hear what some of those questions.
The first question was about peak capacity and whether when you advertise a gigabit, it's 24 hours a day, or does Netflix mean that you won't be able to deliver full capacity? And also, is it easier to give a gig to everybody than trying to provision different speeds for different people?
The answer to the latter question is no. It's not easier just to give a gig to everybody. The equipment can constrain data rates pretty easily. So our provisioning systems, it's just sending commands to ONUs. We do gig to everybody for a number of reasons, because we want to really advance the web forward, not just build a slightly differentiated product. We want to build a different product. We design the service to deliver a real gigabit to users. And I think in our peak hour, people still can run speed tests and a variety of things that show, well, it's okay, it's down to 850 megabits, et cetera. By putting CDNs directly in Kansas City,
CDN,
it offloads.
Just to acronym watch here.
Sorry, content delivery networks, caches for video, effectively. By putting them in Kansas City, it offloads my long-haul network from having to carry that traffic, which makes the long-haul network be more available for other non-cacheable data streams. We watch traffic both on the access systems, the aggregation rings, as well as the long-haul network. And, sure, there's some level of oversubscription. On the other hand, that's something that we manage. It's just basically a network engineering function. So far, we have not seen users see appreciable sort of congestion in peak hours or lowering of speeds. We engineer for 4 gig.
Okay.
We have the optical infrastructure in the city and on the long-haul side to be able to deliver that.
So
There was a question about... Sorry.
Open access was the last question, and what
Sure.
your policy is going forward, whether you're going to do that in all the different cities that you build out.
Yeah, so open access has different meanings. Originally, I think the idea was you do a wholesale-only service, but there's fiber transport and different ISPs are right on top of that. I don't believe that works in North America. At least I haven't figured out a way to make it work in North America for gigabit. The reason for that is if you want to be able to deliver a real gigabit, goes back to the I think second question, not just a gigabit burst speed, but real gigabit. You can't pay retail transit prices to deliver that. You need to be a facility-based transport provider. There are only so many of those, and most of them are incumbents. And incumbents don't compete with each other. That is to say, Time Warner Cable doesn't overbuild Comcast. Verizon doesn't overbuild AT&T. So in a particular market, you're not going to get someone else who has scale, who's an incumbent, coming in to compete with the incumbent. And the incumbent in that market doesn't want to abandon our own infrastructure for a new fiber system. So what you typically find, like in Utah and other cases where there are open access networks, is you have a bunch of small-scale operators who come in who don't have transport scale. And they all basically pay the same amount for retail distribution, and they start competing with each other by who can cut costs for sales and marketing expense or customer care, etc. That doesn't work. So if you really want a gigabit, you need to have somebody who's got enough transport capacity to be able to do that inexpensively enough, so that the gigabit can have more or less universal take rate. So if you leave the incumbents aside, that only leaves 2 large-scale transport networks in North America, one by Level 3 and one by us. And so if we didn't use our economics on transport, we wouldn't be able to offer a real gigabit at affordable prices. Other countries have different regulatory structures that it may work for them. but I cannot see a way of it working in North America, not with the current industry structure.
Okay, next question. And please identify yourself.
Yes, Stephen Fitzmaurice with the YEO Network. It was offered earlier that LTE is a great way to get rural America connected, but with the industry focus on data caps and a lot of other cost limitations there, is that really going to help them compete fairly?
I didn't say great way. I just said way.
But, I mean, how can we innovate beyond LTE then, especially when we are talking about the high cost of getting folks
Well, if
wired
we're
up?
just talking about rural America, what I think is the fundamental dilemma is that we have two very different phenomenon. One is a new form of competition, which, you know, you can make a judgment about whether that's a good substitute. I will simply note that if you want the government to collect money from urban people and send it to rural people, there has to be a limiting factor. In other words, LTE might not be as good, but is it really worth it to take, you know, $1,000 from some poor urban people? 80% of the people who pay in, people below the poverty level, according to some study, pay into the Universal Service Fund and don't get anything out. And so, do we really want to pay rural? What's the limiting factor? But the other problem is increasingly already in institutional uses, you need a wire. And that's part of the dilemma that, frankly, the FCC has to grapple with. I don't think they've grappled with yet. I think it's a very difficult challenge. But as to the question of whether LTE is a substitute product, I think we have to wait and see how people respond and what the uses are. And by the way, the answer in 2015 may be very different than the answer in 2018. But I don't, you know, I remember when Mike and I were at the commission early on, we thought wireless voice would never substitute for wired. And obviously on the basis of consumer behavior, it does. So we'll have to see.
Craig, do you have any comments about broadband wireless and how the communities you're working with view it?
I think that we need to be maybe more open to the fact that in certain communities, wireless is going to be the only way to get there. I was just in Cambria County in Pennsylvania, which is very rural. They have lots of hills and lots of trees. They've got, the county basically has built a fiber line into the biggest city of that county, but then they have a series of towers on these mountaintops that do line of sight, point to point, and they have managed to connect something like 80–90% of their constituents using this network of towers, right, using point to point. So it's not LTE, I mean, it's basically something different. I bring this up to say, in addition to, you know, looking at the fact that you just can't put fiber into certain places terrain-wise, on the other end of the line, I've had folks on my show talking about their gigabit wireless networks. So in essence, there is technology coming on the market that will allow WISP and others to build a wireless network that can deliver, again, as point to point. But I see that, you know, we got to look at the fact that technology is improving to a point where wireless can be viable, and there's also the fact that in certain communities, it's for a while is going to be the only way that you're going to be able to get there. So the fact that that technology is improving is a plus. But I think we talk a lot about LTE as if this was like the great savior of technologies, whereas there are other brands of wireless. I think we need to open people's eyes to those possibilities.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn to the Twitter sphere now. Judith, do we have any questions? We had other people online waiting as well. You're next. You're next.
Sorry about that. Actually, we do have a question, not from the Twitter sphere, but from the live stream chat. And the question is, how are Gigabit providers understanding aggregate demands or needs in communities so they ensure they set up the right type of infrastructure or offer the right package? Is it mostly door-to-door? How are they going about doing it? I think that question is for Milo. And then also, there's a question about will cable have to dump DOCSIS, and will they do that?
Well, I don't know if anybody's going to take the second question, but Milo, do you want to talk a little bit about marketing and how you get people to sign up for Google Fiber?
Sure. Again, what we did in Kansas City was we basically said, if you want gigabit in your neighborhood, the fiber hoods are 800 to 1,000 home areas, usually around the size of an elementary school district. If you want gigabit in your community, you want it at your house, get your neighbors to sign up. And we built an online portal where everybody who went on pre-registered, the needle, the thermometer, if you want to look at it, for that fiber hood moved to the right, and then it went from red to yellow to green. All of this was totally public, so our competitors could see that at the same time, the press could see it, and you found this, fiber hoods were competing with each other for who had the highest take rate. There was celebrations when a fiber hood crossed the line and hit qualification. And so for 6 weeks, we ran this process with very specific level of marketing, again, in each fiber hood. And in that period of time, I think almost 25% of the homes passed in that first build area signed up pre-registered for the product. And then, of course, the nice part about that is we do one last go through before we build of now's the time, because basically we put all our installers into those fiber hoods to build, and then we go to the next one. So if you didn't sign up, it might be a year or two before we get back to you, because I have this large backlog of other fiber hoods who haven't had any service installed. And so people have to decide, do I want it or do I potentially miss out? And I may not get it for a while, because that's the most cost-effective way for us to install the maximum number of users at the fastest rate. Just do it chunk at a time, build new areas. So that ties into the marketing as well.
Okay. We have a question here from the room.
So I'm Cathy Sloan with Computer and Communications Industry Association. And it struck me when Craig was talking about building local fiber networks as a marketing exercise, basically, and identifying consumer needs and demand and bundling and aggregating that demand. It just struck me why, since that is a local, since that is a core competency of the incumbent inter-exchange or local exchange carriers and incumbent internet access providers, why wouldn't they be taking on that marketing exercise?
I think Craig dropped off for just a second, so he missed part of your question. But the question was basically why aren't the incumbent providers stepping up to this challenge? Why aren't they out there meeting the needs of the communities that Craig's working with? I'll turn it to Blair and then over to you, Craig.
First of all, I wouldn't say it's a marketing challenge. I would characterize it slightly different. But it's not a technology challenge. It's not even an economic challenge. It's really an organizing challenge. And what we have found in the Gig.U communities is any community that wants a gig can get it if they're willing to organize to that end. There are lots of different priorities. For some, that actually shouldn't be a priority. They have other needs. But if you want to organize to that, you can get it. And that fundamentally follows the formula I mentioned earlier, which is also the explanation for why incumbents, I believe, don't want to do it. It's entirely rational. What the incumbents are doing on the wireline side is harvesting investments that have been made over a long period of time. Very, very significant investments, very large investments. But the fundamental narrative to Wall Street now is a harvest story, not a growth story. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, I wouldn't criticize them for that. We'll see how it plays out. That's the great thing about markets. I do think that there are certain things that government policy should do and other things it shouldn't do. I don't think it should force the incumbents to build gigabit networks. But I think it should make the environment possible so that we have that virtuous cycle where we do get that upgrade and there's constantly a drive. And thankfully Google has stepped up as well as some other folks have stepped up to that. But it is not, if you look at the fundamental economics, they're better off harvesting at lower speeds than having a new round of CapEx.
Craig, do you want to answer this question? Why do you think the incumbents aren't more aggressive in meeting the needs of these communities?
Well, I've sat through presentations and meetings where basically the incumbent has said that unless there are numbers, X number of people, subscribers per some measured geographical area, they will not bring service to that community. Or if they do, it will be at a cost that's untenable for that community. And that pretty much is the bottom line. I mean, they do not want to invest in an area unless they're going to get a certain level of return and have a certain level of overhead. And one of the reasons why you have communities that are engaging in this process, whether we're talking a community like EC Fiber in Vermont, or that is basically building its own network. I mean, its own people contribute to the actual workforce to lay the conduit in the ground because they can reduce the overhead by as much as half. Then they're moving forward, and that is the reflection of the opposite opposite side of the coin, where the incumbent's saying no because it costs us X, we won't go there. Well, then the communities then through whatever means.
How many homes do they want to see? What percentage of homes do the incumbents want as customers before they'll sign up and actually deploy?
Right, I didn't hear all of that.
Craig, when you talk to the incumbents, what kind of penetration rate do they want to see before they make a commitment to deployment?
It is, I wouldn't so much call it, well, okay, so the last time I listened to someone give this explanation, and I didn't unfortunately write down the numbers, it was basically a number of customers. It wasn't about percentage, it was just basically raw numbers. They need to see X number of dollars, and it is represented by X number of customers paying whatever their average contract rate is. I don't know if it's a formula. In a separate discussion, it was basically an issue of the incumbent said, well, if we build it, we will charge you to build it, and we want to own it, and you can't have a say over the network. If you want us to build it for you, it will basically cost you less, and then you can go ahead and we'll build it, and you can make your own decisions, yada, yada, yada. We just want to be able to sell services over that network.
Okay.
And in both those numbers, those were not acceptable to the community.
Okay. So we have 5 minutes left, so another question from Patrick.
One thing about Americans' deployment over broadband, or even policy that I've seen over the last 10 years, has been a kind of government trying to get a promise out of telcos, like from the 1999 Broadband Act, where they said, okay, we'll let you do certain things policy-wise that allow you to basically close off competition. And then we'll give you $10 billion over 5 years to deploy through rural areas, but then that promise is not kept. And then you also see things like at the FCC where Commissioner Meredith Baker went from allowing the merger for NBC Universal and Comcast to happen, and then 2 months later she became their government liaison. What kind of things do you think can happen to stop this kind of government-level corruption when it comes down to infrastructure and telecom in America?
Strong words. Government corruption. Anybody want to take that question? Blair will.
I just got back from Myanmar, where I was for the State Department, and I'm just going to say, corruption? Are you kidding me? This is a more serious point. When you talk about corruption, I think you have to be a little bit careful. I certainly don't regard Meredith as a corrupt person. I think it was unfortunate for a variety of reasons, and I do think that the government has not been diligent in trying to enforce certain obligations. But that I'm somewhat sympathetic to government officials on that. I think we have to understand that there's a fundamental change, and here's the fundamental change. In the past, the primary paradigm for policy has been a social contract based on a monopoly. Literally 100 years ago, Kingsbury Commitment, first real one, the government said to what became AT&T, we will let you be a monopoly, but you have to serve everyone. That was a fundamental deal. In the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, the fundamental deal between local governments and the cable industry was, we'll let you be a monopoly in multi-channel video, but you got to serve everyone. Those were actually, I would argue they were fairly good deals, but you know, historians can argue about that. But that was what the deal was. The deal starts changing really and is manifested in the 96 Act, which is we're now going to have a competitive playing field. But it's complicated, right? And markets shift and things that we don't anticipate occur. And so what we need is a new paradigm. I think the deal between Google and Kansas City, which we have in GIG.U stolen, thank God they didn't try to get any intellectual property on it. But there's a version of that in Seattle, there's a version of that in Chicago, there's a version of it in North Carolina. And I think it is a new model. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying it's a new model that helps drive an upgrade that I think benefits the local community tremendously. But we're going to be in a period of testing these things out. And I think we have to accept that the fundamental economics of the prior deals are disappearing. And so we can't hold those companies to the same things we used to. But we still need to find a way to make sure that the public goods that come out of the privately funded networks remain, and that we get that collective benefit. That's not an easy thing. This is what the FCC is hopefully going to do with the so-called IP transition, subject for another day. But I don't, in my experience at the Commission, and anyone who's read my recent speeches or actually understood what I said earlier knows I'm not a big fan of certain FCC policies, but I will defend them. I don't believe it's a corrupt place. I just think it's a challenged place because of the way they're thinking about the problems.
I have to agree with Blair there, having spent 10 years in government. Never ascribe to corruption what can be explained by inertia, incompetence, and cluelessness. Right. But the fact is, the most exciting thing for me in the Google initiative and in the GIG.U initiative is this effort to just clear out the regulatory underbrush. I'm a techno-utopian, cyber-libertarian Democrat. And I want to see networks for everybody. And I know that a lot of the rules and regulations are getting in the way. And I'd like to ask Milo a really quick quantitative question. How much do you think you've cut from the regulatory budget and the lawyering expenses by doing what you've done? How much of the regulatory underbrush have you been able to eliminate? I don't want a number in dollars, but maybe a percentage.
I think we've probably hit maybe 50% of kind of total benefit. A lot of the issues the locals can't address. You've got federal issues on pole attachment, which don't give people like us the ability to attach to poles. And so that generates a whole set of dynamics with utilities and the rest that makes things much more complicated. That being said, I think we've done a pretty good job of taking a whack at it. We're getting better at it. I think our agreements with Austin reflect learnings in Kansas City, and the more cities we do, the more of that learning gets incorporated in our processes to improve things.
It's funny you mentioned pole attachments, because when I joined the FCC 15 years ago, I first realized just how Kafkaesque and surreal the regulatory environment was when they explained to me that cable companies pay one price for attaching a wire to a pole, electric utilities pay a different price, phone companies pay a different price, and we had no idea what to charge Google. Anyway, last comments here from our panelists. Blair did lay out a challenge for us at the very end of his talk, saying, why can't we be Israel? So I would ask our panelists for a closing comment, and if you have a thought on how we can make sure we at least keep pace with Israel, let us know. So Blair, I'll turn to you, then Craig, then Milo.
Well, I'm actually interested in how other people answer the question. I will simply note that, Israel has certain kind of density advantages and geographic advantages, and but when Chambers made that comment, he said something else I think is really significant, which is the leadership of Israel is looking toward the future. And the problem that we have, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that in terms of broadband policy, we have actually not, if you're looking at the present, what you're actually looking at is the past. And what we
Exactly.
need is for leadership that's looking toward the future.
So Craig?
I'm a big proponent of learning lessons, as many lessons as we can from other countries, and adapting whichever lessons that make sense for us here in the U.S. But bottom line, I will always be a believer that the local, whether it's city, whether it's county, township, what have you, they should be the drivers of broadband solutions, and are at the state level and the federal level, they should be the facilitators, whether it's by removing regulations or adding regulations or streamlining processes for getting money or whatever it is that happens. But I think that the local communities are what should be driving more of the discussion, more of the activity, and more of the solutions that happens when it comes to getting faster, better broadband into those communities. And I will always stand by that.
So national policies help, but local communities will really drive it. Okay,
They
Milo,
should.
your thoughts.
So I would say one of the advantages some countries have is they have a clear monopoly or a clear dominant national provider. And the governments know how to deal with those. You regulate them. And so you can say, well, you've got one incumbent, you are going to do a gigabit upgrade. That's the way it is. We don't have that. We don't really have competition, but we don't have a pure monopoly either. So in some ways, the U.S. gets the worst of both worlds because you have two large industries who have a lot of revenue coming out of the existing networks, and a gigabit upgrade along the lines of what Israel is doing would basically cause a lot of economic disruption in those incumbent companies, and nobody really wants to do that. It boils down fundamentally, however, regardless of how you get there, it goes back to what Blair said, it's an issue of leadership. If the country really cared about this, there are a bunch of things they could do to make things a whole lot better. But realistically, I think it's fair to say certainly the leadership in Washington doesn't care about it. If they did, they would be talking as much about it as how much auction proceeds they're going to get by UHF spectrum to go pay for FirstNet, et cetera. If you look at the FCC testimony by Wheeler and what the senators were asking about, gigabit was not the dominant conversation. There's a bunch of policies on rights of way, et cetera, that the administration could change, but they aren't. And so we just have to deal with the fact that this is not an important topic with regards to the nation's leadership. That may change over time, but that's the way it is right now.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my final comment, which is that we are trying to change the debate. We have about 40 people here in the room and a lot more people watching. We all care about gigabits, and I think if we can have the conversation, push the process, we can make a difference. I'm very glad that Google was willing to host this discussion, that the Internet Society pulled this together. I particularly want to thank Judith Hellerstein, who proposed this idea, Paul Brigner, who made it possible for everyone to participate remotely, and I also want to thank our panelists, our two people on the West Coast who got up before dawn, Craig Settles and Milo Medin, and Blair Levin, who's here in person. I don't know if our remote participants will be able to stay on the line, but there were a few more questions in the audience. People might want to actually have a conversation with you if you can stay for another 5 or 10 minutes. Is that possible, Milo and Craig?
Sure, people don't show up here at Google for another 4 hours. Anyway, so
And I'm only going back to sleep after this is over, so.
Okay. And we also will try to answer any questions that people had on Twitter, via Twitter. So thank you very much for a great program, great questions, great panelists.